plus for Mac.
Is that better?
Jazakallah khair.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the first question is, how can we make a prenup stipulating that Islamic law is used in all disputes? I've heard it's easy to get it thrown out. So what's the point of doing it? Okay, so I think that's the problem, is that when people create prenuptial agreements, they're kind of lazy, right? And they say that, okay, upon divorce, everything is going to be determined by Islamic law. And you can imagine that if a contract like that is given to a judge, an American non-Muslim judge, and they say, okay, everything's going to be according to Islamic law, number one, they might object and say, okay, why are we interpreting Sharia law? Why are we letting the judge interpret what Islamic law has to say? Rather, the way that you write these prenuptial agreements is you make it look like, you know, some non-Muslim contract, and you basically dictate what Islam would say without saying Islam. Okay, and so if you have those three factors, right? You have attorneys on both sides, you had the full financial disclosure, you signed it well in advance, then in those situations, like for example, let's say that you stipulate in your prenuptial agreement that anything I purchase during the marriage will be mine, anything that she purchases during the marriage will be hers, anything that we make joint will belong to the both of you. That's typically how we do prenuptial agreements in our office. Those are the standards. Okay, there's nothing to do with Islam, right? And so why wouldn't a judge enforce that? The second part of it is alimony. Okay, in an Islamic prenuptial agreement, theoretically, we are going to waive maintenance and say that there's no long-term maintenance except for the first 3 months, according to Islamic law. So again, you're not saying that. What you're saying is upon divorce, husband shall provide $3,000 a month for the first 3 months after divorce. So we're making it look like a non-Muslim contract. Okay, so I hope that answers that question. As a future high earner, what can I do to ensure my wealth and assets are protected from a 50-50 split in the worst case scenario? Prenuptial agreement. All right, I mean, number one, if you're going to get legally married, prenuptial agreement. If you're not going to get legally married, well, you might not have to worry about it. But then you can use these other things. So again, the prenuptial agreement is the best way to ensure that you control what happens on divorce, because you're right. It would be a 50-50 split. And that's not worst. And I think there's another misconception. It's not worst case scenario. That should be the expectation, right? Don't think that, okay, if I get divorced, oh my gosh, she's going to get half of everything. That's the expectation, right? Okay, should we have a prenup? Should the marriage contract turn into a prenup? Okay, so I'm guessing what you mean is that the marriage contract, I'm thinking you're meaning that one-page paper that you sign at the time of marriage, or I know now online they're like giving these templates for marriage contracts. So the problem is that a lot of those quote unquote marriage contracts, like those more robust ones, they have day-to-day implications, and they talk about, okay, you can't marry a second wife and you have the right to issue divorce and things like that. So what I would say is maybe have two separate agreements. Okay, one is the prenuptial agreement that's going to be recognized by the state, that's going to incorporate what happens on divorce, and now you're letting the state interpret it. The marriage contract, the Nikah contract, I think you can do separately. That talks about those issues about the day-to-day aspects, that talks about, you know, those Islamic types of things. And again, with the understanding that the state might not recognize that particular contract. Okay. Is it true all your assets are 50-50 when you get married? So it's not like as soon as you get married, whatever you had beforehand now becomes 50-50, right? The starting point of the accumulation of 50-50 is at the time of marriage. So let's say that I came in with 100,000, wife came in with 100,000. Okay, we get married at this point. That 100,000 is still going to be mine. Her 100,000 is going to be hers. Now, as we move forward, and now we start to accumulate money, that's what's going to be divided 50-50. So I hope that answers that question. Can you give a template for a prenup to include what should be written regarding finances and or caring of children Islamically? Okay, so the problem with templates is unlike a will. So in order for a will to be valid, you just need a signature and maybe 2 witnesses. Okay, and now the will is valid. The problem with the prenuptial agreement is that it's not simply a document that you sign, right? the exercise of disclosure, the exercise of hiring an attorney is part and parcel of a valid prenup, right? So that's why, you know, there could be documents that kind of show you what would be involved in a prenuptial agreement, and maybe inshallah I could do something like that. But there has to be an understanding that you can't just download a prenup agreement between you and wife, sign it, and hope that the state court is going to, you know, enforce that. Okay, Dr. Yasser Qadi mentioned in one of his Q&A that we can do a binding Islamic arbitration in case of divorce. Where could I go for this in the state of Texas? I'm not from Texas. I'm not sure if Sheikh Joe Bradford or Imam Mahad has something like that in Texas, but yes, you could do binding arbitration in a prenuptial agreement, but understand that the way that Muslims typically write their prenuptial agreements, there's not much to arbitrate, right? Because we actually simplify marriage in the sense that what's yours is yours, what's yours is yours. If there's anything that's joint, so like there's not much to fight about in court because you just look at the title. Whereas in the standard default way, everything is open and everything could be considered marital. So we actually, by using Islamic law, we make the divorce process 10 times easier. But that being said, yes, you could use Islamic arbitration with the understanding that you can't address children necessarily. Okay. If one side doesn't like the decision of an Islamic arbitrator and goes to a secular court, are any proceeds, wealth given from the secular court haram? I can't answer haram halal. Inshallah, Sheikh Joe Bradford can answer that question for us. If I don't do a legal marriage, what avenues are there to get my spouse the rights benefits normally allocated to a legal partner? Okay, so that's where some limitations do come in, right? Because when you get legally married, you get, for example, healthcare benefits, right? I think that's really the biggest one, is you get to be on that person's insurance. I'm not aware of any contract or anything like that that would allow you to name your spouse as a beneficiary, you know, as a spouse on the health insurance. However, for other things, there are ways to address it. For example, hospital issues. You can do a power of attorney to have your husband and spouse be your power of attorney so that they can make those healthcare decisions for you. You can name your spouse in a will. You could name them as a beneficiary on your accounts. You can, so there's ways to kind of plug the holes in a non-legal marriage. But I think really the one limitation that I haven't found out a way to fix is the healthcare, meaning the health insurance benefits. Almost everything else, there is a way, inshallah, to plug those holes. I would like to know more about the rights and obligations of children from previous marriage. Maybe we can talk about that in the divorce section. So after this, we'll take a break and then we'll dive into the divorce, inshallah. What legal protections are available if I'm a US citizen and my spouse is a UK citizen? So legal protections would really come into play based off where you reside. Okay, so because usually that's the court that you're going to file in, that's the court you're going to sue in. So let's say US citizen marries a UK citizen and now they move to the US and they live in Texas. Well, if you're going to get divorced in Texas, that's what law is going to apply. They don't necessarily look to where you were married. They look at where you're getting divorced, and those laws are what typically are going to be enforced, unless, of course, you have a prenuptial agreement. So what legal protections are available? It's a very broad question, but I think the point is that the law the court that you use, those are the laws that are going to be applied. The state that you live in, that's the laws that are going to be applied. For prenups, I heard to make sure other party has their own attorney that represents them to ensure prenup validity in future, as well as, yeah, 100%. You have to have your own, and I don't know why you're putting own in quotes, but so much so that I actually tell my clients, don't pay for the other side's attorney. Let them, if you want to, give them the money and let them pay. Because yes, you're right. You want them to have separate own attorneys that can tell them what this is all about. So yes, that is a something you need for a valid prenuptial agreement. And one thing I think I might have saw somewhere, postnuptial agreements. So a prenuptial agreement is something that's signed prior to the marriage, and a postnuptial agreement is something that's signed after the marriage, but the impact is the same. You're still dictating what happens upon divorce. The only difference between a prenup and a postnup is the requirement that it be signed prior to the marriage doesn't stand, obviously. But the two lawyers and the full financial disclosure still apply for postnuptial agreements. Postnuptial agreements are very helpful when a party is thinking about divorce, or maybe you've learned the benefits of a prenuptial agreement. You're already married, so you can do a postnuptial agreement. Is inheritance in a trust fund protected from being considered as marital property? Generally, yes, as long as that trust fund stays separate and apart and you're not intermingling and commingling that money now with the marital property. So yes, inheritance is supposed to be non-marital property as a general rule. Is it possible to stipulate in the prenup that all matters related to children are resolved in front of a Muslim judge? No. So this is going to throw out your prenup in a second. If you mention child support, if you mention anything to do with children in a prenuptial agreement, no one's going to listen to it, because the thing is that in America, the state has the right or the jurisdiction over the children. And so much so that the state actually determines what's in the best interest of the children. It's crazy. But anything that takes away the power of the state to determine what's in the best interest of the children is going to be invalid. Okay, can we obtain a divorce from another country to avoid US implications if we've gotten married in the US? I don't know if we should transfer this to the divorce or not, but you can't. Okay, so here's the thing. This happens all the time. People are married in America. They live in America, all their properties in America. One guy decides they're going to go to India or Pakistan, issue a divorce because all you have to do is a talaq and pretend that, haha, I got you now, you can't get any of my property. No, if all your property is in Illinois, all your assets are in Illinois, you've been living in Illinois, most likely that the judge is not in America is not going to enforce or recognize that order for a number of reasons. Number one, maybe you didn't give them notice of that divorce. Okay. Number two is in a lot of Islamic countries, they don't address the issue of property. And so the divorce or the judge over here will say, okay, this is not even a complete order. Why would I recognize it? You don't even talk about property. You don't talk about children. All it says is, I declare I'm divorced. So I'd probably avoid that. Do you still need a property in separate property states? Yes, absolutely. So this is a good point. There's certain states that are called separate property states and certain states that are community property states. Okay, Illinois is a separate property. Texas is community property. What does that mean? What this means is it doesn't necessarily, it impacts divorce, but it impacts death more so. In a separate property state, when you pass away, however it's titled, that controls. In a community property state, when you pass away, it doesn't matter what the title says, the spouse will automatically have a 50% right to that property in a community property state. So that being said, the prenup applies both in a separate property state and a community property state, because separate and community, the real impact is upon death, not necessarily marriage. So yes, you do need a prenup, whether you're in a separate property state or in a community property state. I'm recently married. Does a postnup have the same process and strength as a prenup? Yes, yes, it does. Is there any sunset clause that are included? I'm not sure what you mean by a sunset clause. Are you saying like an expiration date? Yeah, I think I would need a little bit more clarification. Okay, sorry, where am I? Okay, sunset clauses, I'm not sure what you mean. Will a spouse leave a will that dictates his, or will all the parties in the absence of prenup? Without a prenup, will a spouse be able to leave a will that dictates his inheritance? Yes. A spouse can dictate their inheritance in a will, and all of it does not go to the spouse if you don't have a prenup or you don't have a will. So this is a little bit about estate planning. So in estate planning, what happens is that when somebody passes away, you first look at whether they're on the title or they're a beneficiary. So if you own a house with your spouse, okay, you don't have a will, you don't have anything, you don't have a prenup, but you pass away. automatically 100% of that property now belongs to your spouse because they're a joint owner on that house. Okay, that's one scenario. Let's say in another scenario, husband passes away. The house is only his. He left no will, no prenup. What happens? In that scenario, the wife, what would happen in that scenario is that state law would apply. And in state law, she would get 50%. It's called intestate succession. Basically, automatically, just by being your spouse, you pass away, you didn't make a will, you didn't do any planning. The state assumes you want to give 50% to your spouse. Whatever is left then is divided equally amongst your children. So you can leave a will. You can dictate how that property is going to be distributed, but just understand that title and beneficiary supersede what you write in a will. Okay. Can child-related issues be included in a Nikah agreement? You can include it, but it's not going to be enforceable. Is there a possibility to have joint representation? No, you can't have just joint representation in a prenuptial agreement. Maybe in a operating agreement, LLC, you can, because that person is now representing the company, but it might not be very smart. Can you have a prenup for mahr and other stuff and then operational agreement strictly for purchasing property together? You can do that, but the problem is that if you're legally married, you get a prenup, you want to make sure that that prenup addresses the business, right? Especially if you're doing that for marital purposes, for allocation purposes, I would make sure that the prenup talks about the business. For people who want second, third, or fourth wives, yeah. I mean, there's a problem, right? Because if your first wife is legally married to your first wife, and the other individuals, quote unquote, are under different types of agreements, it could become a big problem. And I think we'll talk about it in the divorce side. How can women secure themselves and marry someone as a second, third, since you're more than one marriage? Yeah, operating is basically using one of these methods, using a operating agreement, using a maybe not a cohabitation agreement, maybe a promissory note. Is it legal to get the nikah done without state wedding? In Illinois, it is not allowed. You're not allowed to conduct a marriage ceremony without it being licensed. So this whole, not nikah only marriages can be a problem in certain states, but honestly, I haven't seen any states really enforce that. I haven't seen anybody get arrested or anything like that for it. But yes, in certain states, in Illinois, it is illegal to do a quote unquote ceremony, wedding, without a license, state license. Where are the statistics coming from? Muslims are 33%. I think Imam Mahad had mentioned the study yesterday. There's a group in Michigan that did a study. I don't have access to that study. I'm not sure if that was provided as part of the handouts or not. Is there a template for prenup that stipulates Islamic law? No, like I said, those are we've talked about the issues of why perhaps you could have a template for a will, but not for a prenup. So those are all the questions. I'm sorry if I went a little fast.
That was great. Thank you. I just have, before we go into break, there's 2 questions I'm gonna put in the chat that were too long for Slido. If you could address them either now or before, after the break, feel free.
Okay, one second. So which one are you talking about?
In the Zoom chat, I just listed 2. If the marriage terms clauses.
Okay. Yeah, if the marriage terms clauses mahr, where part mahr is agreed, are all written in the nikah contract, cohabitation agreement, is it not enforceable between the parties under civil law as a bilateral contract? All 3 requisites of a contract are met: offer, acceptance, consideration. So the thing is that it depends on the state, right? Like, because once you have marriage being the consideration, then the state has the purview to make it a prenuptial agreement. So that's the problem. Yes, you have offer, acceptance, and consideration, but when marriage is the consideration, it becomes under the rubric and under the lens of a prenuptial agreement. So that's really the problem in a cohabitation agreement. But if other states are okay with cohabitation agreements, then you're fine. That would be a bilateral contract that you can now enforce in civil court. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, it's not clear to me. And by the way, I'm not a sheikh, I'm just some random dude. Did sheikh say that if you have a prenup, then whatever money you make after you get married gets split 50-50, but whatever money you had before you got married, you get to keep? Yes. So if you have a prenup, then there's no general result. You are dictating what the result is. So if you have a prenup that says everything gets split 50-50, that's what's going to happen. If you have a prenup that says, nope, everybody keeps their own things, that's what's going to happen. If you have a prenup that says everything before marriage is mine, that's what's going to happen. So the prenup is a customizable document, right? So I hope that answers the question. How would we word mahr payment in the prenup? Would it be a debt to the wife to be paid by the husband? Yes, basically what you say is, there's different types of mahr. I mean, we should be paying our mahr upfront, and women should be taking that mahr and they should be investing it, because the purpose of the mahr is long-term protection, right? I don't know why we have this concept or this tradition or this cultural thing about paying the mahr later. I mean, yeah, it could help you after you get divorced, but the point is to let that money grow so that God forbid, by the time you divorce, that there's actually something there. Women need to start get mahr of returnable assets, be it a house or be it a brokerage account or whatever. There's no point in just having $3,000 sitting in your account. That's a different story. Would it be a debt to the wife? Yeah. So basically, it's kind of like a debt, or basically what you would say is maintenance. It's kind of a maintenance payment. The power of state over children. How risky is it to file for divorce while having children? Are you giving up your rights over children when you file for divorce while having children? Yeah, theoretically, because what happens is that if husband and wife don't agree on what happens, then the state's going to decide. Debts, same thing applies as assets. If the debts are before marriage, it's non-marital, it's your responsibility. Any debts accumulated after marriage are both people's responsibility. Yes, you can amend the prenup after mutual consent. Can you stipulate in the prenup for the nikah contract to be enforceable? No, I would rather just whatever terms you want enforced in the nikah contract, I would implement them in the prenup itself. I would not want